Starting a nonprofit and wondering whether to get started on your own or partner with a co-founder? A lot of the advice I've seen out there is confusing or contradictory, so let's talk through it together. I actually did start my nonprofit with a co-founder, and that experience completely changed how I think about leadership partnerships today. There were so many lessons I learned throughout that whole process that I didn't fully understand at the time, but today I do. So by the end of this video, you're going to have a lot more clarity on the whole co-founder situation. I'm going to share the pros and cons of starting with a co-founder, how I would personally navigate a co-founder relationship completely differently today, and a few things to think about as you consider whether starting a nonprofit with a co-founder actually makes sense for you. So let's jump right in. So before we talk through the pros and cons of working with a co-founder, I want to share a little bit of my background story. I actually haven't talked about this much in past videos before, but when I started my nonprofit, like I was saying, I had a co-founder. She was actually my best friend from high school. And we both cared really deeply about the same issues, and we were both really determined to make a difference in our community and hopefully beyond our community someday. But what we didn't realize when we were getting started and filing the paperwork to make our nonprofit official was that we were coming to the table with completely different visions for how the organization was going to evolve. So over the first year, those differences really started to come to light, and we had a lot of disagreements around mission direction and what to prioritize and what programs to run and ultimately how the organization should grow. And that was hard because this is my best friend, right? But that tension didn't just stay between the two of us. It quickly affected our board of directors dynamics, and it also caused a lot of chaos and confusion with our volunteers. So about a year after we'd started, she decided to step away from the organization and moved away to finish college. And I continued leading the organization and grew it over time to a sustainable, successful nonprofit. But that early period was a lot harder than it needed to be looking back. Now, real quick, before you get too concerned, fortunately, that experience did not end our friendship. We worked through it and we're still really close friends to this day. But looking back, I realized neither of us were in the wrong. We just had gaps in clarity that mattered a lot more than we realized they would at first. The whole reason I wanted to make this video is to hopefully save you the same tension, confusion, and potential heartache that I experienced. And I want to say that there's no wrong way to do this. Have a co-founder, don't have a co-founder. It's really just about alignment. I'm going to share the things that I would do differently if I was starting all over with a co-founder today. But first, let's talk about the pros and cons of partnering with a co-founder so you can kind of think through what it might be like for you. So now that you know where I'm coming from, let's talk about those pros and cons of having a co-founder when starting a nonprofit. On the pro side, having a co-founder can mean shared emotional stress and emotional load. Starting and growing a nonprofit, I'm not going to lie, can be more lonely than people expect. Lonely and stressful. When things feel overwhelming, and trust me, they will, you're not carrying that alone if you have a co-founder. Another pro is having complementary skill sets. So raise your hand if you're a great public speaker, communicator, or networker. Now raise your hand if you're great at operations or strategy or managing other people. If you didn't raise your hand for one or the other of those, a co-founder who does have the skills you're missing could be a smart move. One person might be more comfortable with planning and systems, and the other person might be better at relationships or community engagement. Otherwise, and there's nothing wrong with this choice either, get ready to train yourself in the areas that you're not as comfortable in, because nonprofits need all of those skills and then some. Okay, so let's talk about some of the cons. On the con side, co-founder relationships introduce complexity immediately, like I shared in my story. Decision-making can take longer. Differences in the overall vision for the organization, like I experienced, or even smaller, more granular things like pace or program design can create friction, especially if the co-founders have different life or scheduling situations, like one is doing this full-time and the other part-time, etc. And in nonprofits, especially where identity and values are often tightly connected to the work, those differences can feel personal very quickly. One person might end up feeling devalued and the other might end up feeling overworked. And without really good communication, resentment can build up. All of this ends up mattering not just internally inside the organization, but externally also. According to Bridgespan and research echoed by the independent sector, leadership alignment is one of the signals that funders and partners pay attention to when assessing whether or not to provide funding and support to your organization. So if you do work with a co-founder, like I said before, alignment is key. Now, in a moment here, I'm going to share the 3 major things I would do differently if I were starting a nonprofit with a co-founder today. But first, I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video. Click and Pledge makes it easy for new and growing nonprofits to start strong and scale with confidence. With Click and Pledge, you're going to get professional grade tools for super affordable startup level costs from day one. They've got customizable donation forms that you can plug right into your website and kick off your online fundraising strategy. But Click and Pledge also has a number of other tools included in their affordable flat monthly costs that you can use as your nonprofit is growing and evolving. Tools like in-person and peer-to-peer fundraising features, video fundraising with embedded donation links right in the videos, text-to-give tools, donor management tools and reporting, and Salesforce and other integrations, all included with no contracts or surprise add-on fees. Now, unlike some platforms that increase your fees as you grow, Click and Pledge pricing stays the same whether you have 10 donors or 10,000 donors. So you can use the QR code and link in the description to check out Click and Pledge, book a demo, and get your first $25 monthly fee waived. I really learned so much about starting a nonprofit with a co-founder, and now I want to talk about what I would do differently if I were doing it all over again today. The first thing that I think I would do differently today is getting much clearer early, like before any kind of official nonprofit paperwork is filed. I'd get clear on our unique strengths and our contributions. So when we started, I was very much the planner and the strategy person, whereas my co-founder was incredibly social and was great at getting people to show up and feel connected. Now, at the time, I dismissed her efforts, thinking, well, she was just spending so much time having fun and just making friends. But what I didn't understand yet was how central relationship building is to a nonprofit's success. Looking back now, I see how valuable her efforts were, and I see just how important that relationship building was to the whole success of our mission early on. This is actually a common dynamic I see. One co-founder feels like they're doing all the real work, while the other is focused on what looks like on the surface to be the fun stuff. But what I realize is that the tension usually isn't about effort, it's about how value is being defined. So if I were doing this again, I would explicitly sit down with my co-founder and talk through our strengths and how they support the mission, and then figure out where we fill each other's gaps. A practical way to do this is asking, what do I bring to the table that would be genuinely hard to replace? And what does my co-founder bring to the table also? Now, the second thing that I would do differently today is spend a lot more time aligning on the vision and the values and the long-term outcomes for the organization. It's easy to say you're aligned because you care about the same issue. But what actually ends up guiding decisions in the organization is whether you share the same picture of what success looks like in the real world and how you're going to get there. So for my past co-founder and I, the disconnect would show up around the specific changes that we're trying to create in the community, the right approaches to create those outcomes, and what activities would actually move the needle to make progress. Neither of us were really wrong about what we wanted to do. We just had a different idea of what we wanted to do. And we hadn't talked deeply enough early on about those differences. So if I were working with a co-founder again today, I would work through a few key questions with them. This would be questions like, what is the main problem in our community that our nonprofit should be solving, and for whom? Who are we serving? I would work through, what do we believe success should look like in 10 years if we're making progress? What are the top 3 to 5 values that should guide how we approach this work together? What do we believe in about how this work should get done? And if during our conversations around these questions, we realized we couldn't agree on the responses or come to a meaningful compromise, then that might be a signal that operating as co-founders isn't actually the right path for the organization's benefit and mission. And that leads us to the third major thing that I would do differently today. I would put our expectations of each other as co-founders in writing early. I'm not talking about like a legal contract, just something that clarifies what we've discussed so that we can refer back to it as needed. You might think of this document as like your co-founder operating guide. And for this guide, I would work with my co-founder to write out things like, how are we going to divide responsibilities, referencing those unique strengths and contributions that we bring to the table, and where we might need extra support or help. We would document our shared vision, our values, and our long-term outcomes for the organization. We would talk about how we'll plan to share power and decision-making in leading the organization. We would talk about what is our process going to be for inevitably handling disagreements. And this is a bigger one than you might expect, but we would also talk about our expectations around time and money spent or other personal sacrifices that we might need to make for the organization. Now, thinking through and recording all of this early is going to help prevent quiet resentment from building up and hurting your relationship later, and gives you something neutral to return to if and when things change. Now, there's one more thing I want to talk about real quick, and that is, what if you go through all of this discussion and you realize the co-founder role isn't the right fit for the other person? This doesn't necessarily mean that person can't be involved in the mission. It just means maybe a different role might fit what they want to do for the cause best. So a few other potential roles to consider for this person could be a founding board member. Since nonprofits in most states require a minimum of 3 board of directors members, this might be a good role for someone who's not ready to be a co-founder. They can still help shape the direction of the organization early on, then when their board term ends, potentially make a graceful exit. Or they could be a program lead, someone who enjoys running the programs and services hands-on, even if they don't enjoy the other parts like the background or operating functions of the organization. Or maybe they could be a strategic advisor, someone who offers their special expertise, gives feedback on ideas, or introduces you to others who might support the cause. I want to just reiterate, what actually determines success here isn't whether you have a co-founder. It's, again, how intentionally that relationship is designed. At the end of the day, clarity matters a lot more than speed, and alignment matters a lot more than enthusiasm, and shared understanding matters even more than, yes, shared history. And that's the part that I wish I had understood better early on. So I'd love to hear from you, which part of this feels the hardest right now, or where are you in this whole process? If you're feeling unsure, I highly recommend you spend some quiet time just writing out what you actually want from a potential partner, whether that's a co-founder, board member, or another role that could offer support. And as always, if you want more support navigating, starting, and growing a nonprofit or social enterprise, I do share weekly tips and resources for nonprofit leaders and changemakers in my free newsletter. It's linked below and on my website, changemakercafe.com. In the next video, we're going to talk about the rise of a unique nonprofit model, the hybrid model, and how some nonprofits are turning to starting businesses to bring in sustainable funding. Subscribe so you don't miss that. I'm Amber Melanie Smith, and I'll see you next week. Bye.